I learned about my grandfather's water tower the same week I buried him, and I had no idea it was about to blow up my entire life in the quiet suburb of Meadowbrook Springs, Arizona. My name is Aaron Nichols, and I'd spent most of my 32 years working as a civil engineer in Phoenix, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment while my grandfather, Thomas Nichols, quietly owned a piece of infrastructure that I didn't even know existed. The reading of his will took place in a dusty law office in Scottsdale, where his attorney, a weathered man named Gerald Hampton, slid a folder across the mahogany desk toward me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your grandfather was a shrewd man," Gerald said, adjusting his glasses. "In 1987, when this entire area was nothing but desert scrubland, he purchased 40 acres for next to nothing. The developer who wanted to build what's now the Meadowbrook Springs community needed water infrastructure, but didn't want to pay for it up front." I flipped through the papers, not quite understanding. What does this have to do with me? Your grandfather built the water tower that serves the entire development, all 847 homes. He leased the land to the developer and maintained ownership of the actual tower and all associated equipment. The original agreement stipulated that the homeowners association would pay a quarterly maintenance fee, which they did, religiously, for nearly 4 decades. My hands started shaking as I read the contract. Wait, so I own the water tower? You own the water tower, the pump house, the pressure regulation systems, and the land it sits on. Your grandfather handled all the maintenance himself until about 5 years ago when he hired a local contractor to help. The HOA has been paying into an account that your grandfather used exclusively for tower maintenance and operations. How much are we talking about? Gerald pulled out another document. The quarterly fee is $47,000. Divided among 847 homes, it comes out to about $55 per household per quarter, or roughly $18 a month. Most of them probably think it's just part of their HOA dues and have no idea they're paying for privately owned infrastructure. I sat back in the leather chair, my mind reeling. My grandfather had never mentioned this. Not once. He'd lived modestly in a small house in Tempe, drove a 15-year-old truck, and always told me that hard work and smart investments were the keys to security. I'd thought he meant his retirement account, not a literal monopoly on water service for an entire planned community. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you continue the arrangement. The contract is ironclad and renews automatically. Your grandfather was meticulous about maintenance. The tower is in excellent condition. You'll need to either handle the upkeep yourself or continue with the contractor he used. I have all the documentation here." I took the files home and spent 3 days reading every word. My grandfather had documented everything: inspection reports, pump replacements, coating applications, structural assessments. The man had treated that water tower like it was the Hoover Dam. The contractor he'd hired, a company called Desert Water Systems, sent monthly reports and handled everything from routine inspections to emergency repairs. For the first 6 months after inheriting the tower, I did absolutely nothing different. The quarterly payments came in like clockwork, deposited into the account my grandfather had established. I paid Desert Water Systems their fee, and the remaining profits sat in the account, accumulating. I went to inspect the tower once, driving out to the edge of the Meadowbrook Springs development where it stood like a giant blue sentinel against the Arizona sky. It was actually beautiful in a utilitarian way, with Meadowbrook Springs painted in white letters across its circumference. Everything was fine until the HOA changed leadership. I received an email in November from someone named Deborah Wallace, who identified herself as the new president of the Meadowbrook Springs Homeowners Association. The email was terse and demanded a meeting to discuss the water service arrangement and explore options for cost reduction. I should have seen it coming. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center, a sprawling building near the development's main entrance. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the parking lot already half full. Inside, the main conference room had been set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where 5 people sat with laptops and stacks of papers. Deborah Wallace sat in the center, a woman in her mid-50s with short blonde hair styled in that particular way that seemed to require both a significant amount of hairspray and a standing appointment every 2 weeks. She wore a purple blazer over a white blouse and had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You must be Mr. Nichols," she said as I approached. Her voice had that saccharine quality that immediately put me on guard. "Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us." "Of course," I said, shaking her extended hand. Her grip was firm, competitive. "Let me introduce the board. This is Patricia Morgan, our treasurer, Stephen Chen, our secretary, Linda Kowalski, board member, and Frank Martinez, also a board member." I nodded to each of them. Patricia was a thin woman with glasses and a perpetual frown. Stephen looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Linda had the expression of someone who'd been recruited into this against her better judgment. Frank was the only one who smiled genuinely, giving me a small wave. "Please, have a seat," Deborah said, gesturing to a chair that had been placed across from the board table. I sat down, feeling distinctly like I was being interviewed or interrogated. More residents filed in, taking seats in the rows behind me. By the time Deborah called the meeting to order, there were at least 60 people present. "Thank you all for coming," Deborah began, her voice projecting across the room. "We've called this meeting to address a matter that has recently come to the board's attention regarding our water service. As many of you may not know, the water tower that serves our community is not owned by the HOA or by the city of Scottsdale. It is, in fact, privately owned." A murmur went through the crowd. "We've been paying quarterly fees to the owner for maintenance and operation of this tower. With the recent passing of the previous owner, Thomas Nichols, ownership has transferred to his grandson, Aaron Nichols, who is here with us tonight." All eyes turned to me. I gave a small, awkward wave. "Now, the board has been reviewing our expenses, and we believe that the current arrangement may not be in the best interest of our community. We're exploring options for either purchasing the water tower outright or connecting to the municipal water system." I raised my hand. "May I speak?" Deborah's smile tightened. "Of course." I stood up and turned to face the crowd. "I understand this might come as a surprise to some of you, but the arrangement with the water tower has been in place since this community was founded in 1987. My grandfather built that tower with his own investment and has maintained it impeccably for nearly 40 years. The quarterly fee you're paying works out to about $18 per household per month, which is significantly less than what you'd pay if you were connected to the municipal system." "We haven't verified that," Deborah interjected. "And frankly, Mr. Nichols, we find it concerning that one person has such control over a vital resource for our entire community." "The contract is legal and binding," I said calmly. "My grandfather's attorney can provide all the documentation. Everything has been above board since day one." A man in the third row stood up. "How do we know the tower is being maintained properly? How do we know our water is safe?" "The tower is inspected monthly by a licensed contractor," I explained. "I can provide you with all the inspection reports." The water quality is tested regularly and meets or exceeds all EPA and state standards. In fact, because it's a closed system with modern filtration, the water quality is often better than what you'd get from the municipal supply. Deborah shuffled her papers. Be that as it may, the board feels it's time to explore alternatives. We've already reached out to the city about the cost of connecting to their system. That's your right, I said. But until the current contract expires or is legally terminated, the arrangement stands as is. When does the contract expire? Patricia asked, peering at me over her glasses. It's an automatically renewing contract with no expiration date, I said. The only way to terminate it is if I fail to maintain the tower to specified standards, which I have not, or if both parties agree to terminate. The room erupted in conversation. Deborah banged a gavel on the table. Order, please. Mr. Nichols, the board will be consulting with our attorney about this matter. We'll be in touch. I left the meeting with a knot in my stomach. I'd expected some questions, maybe some curiosity, but Deborah Wallace had turned it into a confrontation. The way she'd positioned it made me sound like some kind of profiteer, when in reality, the fees I was charging were more than fair. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a firm in Phoenix called Morrison & Bates. The letter demanded detailed financial records, maintenance logs, inspection reports, and water quality tests for the past 10 years. It also notified me that the HOA was disputing the next quarterly payment, pending a full review of the service arrangement. I called Gerald Hampton immediately. They can't just stop paying, Gerald said after I read him the letter. The contract is clear. Payment is due regardless of any disputes. If they want to challenge the contract, they need to take you to court, but they still have to pay while that process plays out. So what do I do? Send them everything they're asking for. Your grandfather kept immaculate records, so you have nothing to hide. Then send them an invoice for the quarterly payment with a notice that failure to pay within 30 days will result in late fees as specified in the contract. There are late fees. 5% per month. Your grandfather didn't mess around. I spent the next week compiling everything the HOA had requested. The files filled 3 large boxes. I had every inspection report, every water quality test, every receipt for every repair going back to 1987. I even included photographs of the tower from various inspections, showing its excellent condition. I shipped it all to Morrison and Bates with delivery confirmation. Then I sent the invoice. The quarterly payment of $47,000 was due on December 1st. I sent the invoice on November 15th, giving them plenty of time. The invoice was professional, itemized, and included a copy of the relevant contract sections. At the bottom, I included a polite note reminding them of the 30-day payment window and the late fee structure. December 1st came and went. No payment. On December 5th, I sent a reminder email to Deborah Wallace and the HOA board, copying their attorney. I received a response from Morrison and Bates stating that payment was being withheld pending resolution of contractual ambiguities. There were no ambiguities. The contract was crystal clear. On December 15th, I sent a formal notice of late payment, including the accrued late fees. I also called Desert Water Systems and confirmed that all maintenance was current and that the tower was operating perfectly. On December 20th, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice shrieked at me before I could even say hello. "This is harassment. You're trying to extort this community and we won't stand for it." "Who is this?" I asked, though I already knew. "This is Deborah Wallace. and I'm calling to inform you that the HOA board has voted unanimously to reject your fraudulent invoice. We've discovered that the so-called contract your grandfather created was never properly authorized by the original developer and may be legally void. I took a deep breath, counting to 5. Mrs. Wallace, the contract was executed between my grandfather and Meadowbrook Development Corporation in 1987. It was filed with the county and is a matter of public record. If you believe it's void, you're welcome to challenge it in court. However, until a court rules otherwise, the contract is in force and payment is due. We'll see about that, she snapped. And another thing, we've had complaints about water pressure issues in the north section of the development. Your inadequate maintenance is causing problems. This was news to me. When did these issues start? That's not the point. The point is you're not fulfilling your obligations. Mrs. Wallace, I need specific information. Which homes are affected? When did it start? I'll send the contractor out immediately. I'm not doing your job for you, she said. Figure it out yourself. She hung up. I immediately called Desert Water Systems and spoke to their operations manager, a guy named Rick who'd worked with my grandfather for years. Rick, have you received any reports of pressure issues in Meadowbrook Springs? Not a single one, Rick said. I was just out there on Monday for the routine inspection. Everything's running perfectly. Pressure's consistent across all zones. Can you check again, specifically the north section? I can head out there this afternoon. But Aaron, if there was a pressure problem, we'd know. The system has sensors that alert us to any anomalies. We haven't had a single alert. Rick called me back 3 hours later. I checked every monitoring point in the north section. Pressure is perfect, exactly where it should be. I also knocked on doors at about 10 houses and asked if they'd experienced any issues. Nobody knew what I was talking about. They all said their water has been fine. So Deborah was lying, or making things up. Either way, it was a problem. I documented everything. Rick's inspection, the sensor data, the homeowner statements. I sent it all to the HOA board and their attorney with a polite but firm email noting that the claimed pressure issues appeared to be unfounded, but that I remained committed to maintaining excellent service. Christmas came and went. The unpaid invoice now had nearly a month of late fees attached. I spent the holiday reading and rereading the contract, looking for any weakness, any gap that the HOA could exploit. I couldn't find one. My grandfather had been thorough to the point of paranoia. On January 3rd, I received notice that the HOA was filing a lawsuit. They were suing me for breach of contract, claiming inadequate maintenance, excessive fees, and fraud. The lawsuit also sought an injunction to prevent me from charging late fees. I met with Gerald in his office the next day, bringing every document I had. This is a nuisance suit, Gerald said after reviewing the HOA's filing. They don't have a case. Their own payment history for nearly 40 years demonstrates that they've accepted the contract terms. They can't suddenly claim fraud when they've been willing participants for decades. So what do? We respond. We file a counterclaim for the unpaid fees and late charges, and we prepare for court. But Aaron, I need to warn you, this is going to get expensive. HOA lawsuits can drag on for years, and they have the resources of 847 homeowners behind them. They'll try to bleed you dry in legal fees. I can't just give up the tower. It's my inheritance. I'm not suggesting you give it up. I'm saying you need to be prepared for a fight. We filed our response in mid-January. The court date was set for April, which gave both sides time to conduct discovery and prepare their cases. In the meantime, I continued sending monthly invoices, and the HOA continued refusing to pay. By February, they owed me over $95,000 including late fees. That's when things got weird. I received an anonymous email with the subject line, "You should know what they're planning." The email contained no text, just a PDF attachment. I ran it through every virus scanner I had before opening it. It was the minutes from a closed HOA board meeting. According to the minutes, Deborah Wallace had proposed a plan to force Nichols to sell at a reasonable price. The plan involved a multi-pronged approach: continue the lawsuit to drain my resources, lobby the city to condemn the tower as a public safety hazard, and launch a PR campaign to turn the community against me. The minutes also revealed something else. Deborah's brother-in-law owned a water infrastructure company that had submitted a bid to replace my tower with a new system connected to the municipal supply. The total cost was estimated at $1.2 million, which would be financed through a special assessment on all homeowners. Deborah's brother-in-law stood to make a significant profit. This was a conflict of interest at best, and possibly criminal at worst. I forwarded the email to Gerald, who read it with growing interest. "You know who sent this?" he asked. "No idea. Anonymous email address." "Well, someone on that board has a conscience or a grudge against Deborah. Either way, this is useful. If we can prove that she's pursuing this lawsuit for personal gain rather than the community's benefit, we can get her removed from the board and possibly sue her personally. How do we prove it? Discovery. We subpoena all HOA records, including emails and communications between Deborah and her brother-in-law. We also subpoena the brother-in-law's company records to see if there's been any coordination. The next board meeting was scheduled for February 15th, and it was open to all residents. I decided to attend. The community center was packed, even more crowded than the November meeting. I took a seat in the back row and waited. Deborah called the meeting to order and immediately launched into an update about the lawsuit. "We're fighting to protect this community from predatory pricing and negligent maintenance," she said, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. "Mr. Nichols has refused every attempt at reasonable negotiation." I raised my hand. Deborah's eyes narrowed. "Yes, Mr. Nichols. I'd like to address the board and the community if that's permitted under your bylaws." She consulted with Stephen, the secretary, who nodded reluctantly. "You have 3 minutes." I stood and walked to the front of the room. "Thank you. I want to clarify a few things. First, I have not refused to negotiate. I've simply insisted that any negotiation respect the legal contract that's been in place since 1987. Second, the claim of negligent maintenance is false. I've provided extensive documentation showing that the tower is maintained to the highest standards, and that water quality exceeds all regulatory requirements. Third, I continued, pulling out a printed copy of the leaked meeting minutes, I've recently learned that there may be a conflict of interest at play here. Mrs. Wallace, can you explain your relationship to Desert Infrastructure Solutions? The room went silent. Deborah's face turned red. "I don't know what you're talking about. Desert Infrastructure Solutions is owned by Robert Wallace, your brother-in-law. According to records I've obtained, Desert Infrastructure Solutions submitted a bid to replace my water tower with a new system. If that project goes forward, your family stands to profit significantly. Did you disclose this conflict to the board or to the community?" Patricia, the treasurer, turned to Deborah. "Is this true?" "I don't have to answer these accusations," Deborah stammered. "This is a witch hunt." "It's a simple question," I said calmly. "Did you or did you not disclose that your brother-in-law's company stands to benefit from the elimination of my water tower?" Frank Martinez, the board member who'd seemed friendly at the first meeting, stood up. I'd like to know the answer too. Deborah, if there's a conflict of interest, you should have disclosed it. The meeting devolved into chaos. Residents started shouting questions. Deborah tried to regain control, banging her gavel, but the damage was done. Several residents demanded her resignation on the spot. I slipped out during the commotion and drove home, my heart pounding. I just dropped a bomb that would ripple through the entire community. The next morning, I received an email from Frank Martinez. "Mr. Nichols, I owe you an apology." Several of us on the board were unaware of Deborah's conflict of interest. I've called for an emergency board meeting to address this situation. I think we need to talk about resolving this lawsuit and getting back to a normal business relationship. We met at a coffee shop in Scottsdale 2 days later. Frank brought Linda Kowalski with him. Patricia and Stephen sent their regrets but expressed support for finding a resolution. "Deborah is stepping down," Frank said once we'd settled into a corner booth. Or rather, she's being forced out. Once the conflict of interest came to light, the board had no choice. We're also looking into whether there are grounds for legal action against her. "I'm not interested in going after her personally," I said. "I just want to be paid what I'm owed and continue the arrangement my grandfather established." Linda leaned forward. "Mr. Nichols, Aaron, I think most residents don't have a problem with the water tower arrangement. The fees are reasonable, the service has been excellent, and honestly, most people didn't even know the tower was privately owned until Deborah made it an issue. So what are you proposing? We drop the lawsuit, pay what we owe including late fees, and continue the contract as it stands. In exchange, we'd like you to agree to a few things. Annual community meetings where you or your contractor present an update on tower maintenance, transparency about any major repairs or expenses, and advance notice if you ever decide to sell." It was more than fair. I can agree to all of that. I'd also like to formalize the reporting structure a bit more. My contractor already does monthly inspections, but I'll make sure those reports are automatically sent to the HOA board. And if there are ever any issues, real or perceived, I want to hear about them immediately so they can be addressed. We shook hands on it. The lawsuit was dropped in March. The HOA paid the outstanding balance plus late fees, which totaled just over $103,000. A portion of that went to pay my legal fees, but the rest went into the maintenance account. Deborah Wallace disappeared from community life. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband moved to Tucson. There were rumors of an investigation into other financial irregularities during her tenure as board president, but I never followed up on it. I'd gotten what I wanted. The new board, with Frank as president, was professional and easy to work with. We established a good working relationship. I started attending the quarterly HOA meetings, giving brief updates on the tower's condition and answering any questions residents had. In May, I decided to visit the tower myself for a more thorough inspection. Rick from Desert Water Systems met me there with a ladder and safety equipment. "Want to go up?" he asked, grinning. I looked at the tower, stretching what seemed like 100 feet into the cloudless Arizona sky. "Is it safe?" "Safer than driving on the highway." "Come on, your grandfather climbed this thing until he was 75. We climbed the exterior ladder, Rick going first and talking me through each step. The view from the top was incredible. I could see the entire Meadowbrook Springs development spread out below, a neat grid of houses and streets and parks. Beyond that, the desert stretched to the mountains in the distance. "Your grandfather built something special," Rick said as we stood on the maintenance platform at the top. "This tower has never had a major failure, never lost pressure, never contaminated the water supply. In this business, that's remarkable." I ran my hand along the cool metal railing. He never told me about any of this. He was a private guy, but he was proud of it. He used to tell me that he was providing something essential, something people needed but never thought about. He said that was the best kind of work. Looking out over the community, I understood what he meant. These 847 families went about their lives, turning on taps and filling glasses and watering lawns, never thinking about where the water came from or how it got there. That was how it should be. Infrastructure was meant to be invisible, reliable, taken for granted. My grandfather had built that. And now it was mine to maintain. In June, I made a decision that surprised even me. I quit my job in Phoenix and started my own consulting firm, specializing in small-scale water infrastructure. The tower provided enough passive income that I didn't need a traditional salary, and I found that I genuinely enjoyed the work. I started picking up clients, small towns, private developments, rural communities, helping them design and maintain water systems. I also hired a part-time assistant to help manage the administrative side of the tower operations. Her name was Deanna Wells, a recent graduate from Arizona State University with a degree in civil engineering. She was sharp, detail-oriented, and genuinely fascinated by the history of the Meadowbrook Springs Tower. "I can't believe one person built this," she said during her first site visit. "The engineering is actually impressive for the 1980s. He was ahead of his time on some of this stuff." "He was a stubborn perfectionist," I said. "Probably drove the original contractor crazy. The best engineers usually are." Deanna took over the monthly reporting to the HOA, freeing up my time to focus on other projects. She also suggested some upgrades that would improve efficiency without compromising the system's integrity. We installed new sensors that provided real-time monitoring accessible via smartphone, automated testing equipment for water quality, and a backup generator that could keep the pumps running during power outages. The HOA approved the upgrades without hesitation. The new board trusted us, and the residents had come to appreciate what they had. Several people even stopped me at community events to thank me for maintaining the tower and continuing my grandfather's work. In September, almost a year after that first contentious meeting, the HOA threw a community festival. It was partly a celebration of the development's 40th anniversary and partly just an excuse for neighbors to get together. Frank Martinez approached me as I was sampling some truly excellent barbecue from one of the food trucks. "Aaron, got a minute?" We walked to a quieter area near the community center. "I wanted to run something by you," Frank said. "We've been talking about creating a small museum or display about the history of Meadowbrook Springs. The development has an interesting story built on the edge of the desert, one of the first planned communities in this part of Scottsdale. We'd like to include information about the water tower and your grandfather's role in making all this possible." "I think he'd like that," I said. "I have a lot of his old photographs and documents, notes from the construction, that sort of thing." "That would be perfect. We're thinking of putting up a plaque near the tower too, if you're okay with that." "What would it say?" Frank pulled out his phone and showed me a mock-up. The plaque was simple, bronze with raised lettering, Meadowbrook Springs Water Tower. Constructed 1987 by Thomas Nichols. For 40 years, this tower has provided clean, reliable water to our community, a testament to vision, engineering excellence, and commitment to service. I felt a lump in my throat. "Yeah, that's perfect." The plaque was installed in October. The HOA held a small dedication ceremony, and Frank asked if I wanted to say a few words. I kept it brief, talking about my grandfather's dedication and his belief that good infrastructure was the foundation of community. Deanna stood beside me, having helped compile the historical materials for the display. After the ceremony, an older gentleman approached me. He had white hair and walked with a cane, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're Thomas's grandson," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Aaron Nichols." "I'm Walter Hodges. I was the project manager for the original Meadowbrook Development Corporation. I worked with your grandfather on the tower." We shook hands, and I felt like I was connecting to a piece of history. "Your grandfather was the most meticulous SOB I ever worked with," Walter said, chuckling. "He rejected the first 3 contractors we brought him because he didn't think they understood the scope of what we needed. Finally found one who met his standards, and then he supervised every single day of construction. Drove everyone crazy, but damn if he didn't build something that lasted. He never told me about any of this. That was Tom, never one to brag, but he cared deeply about doing things right. When we were planning this development, everyone said we should just connect to the city water system. Tom argued that a dedicated tower would be more reliable, more efficient, and would give the community independence. He was right on all counts. Walter stayed for over an hour, telling me stories about my grandfather that I'd never heard. How he'd insisted on using higher-grade materials than were specified in the original plans, paying the difference out of his own pocket. How he'd designed redundant systems so that maintenance could be performed without interrupting service. How he'd hand-picked the location for the tower to ensure optimal pressure distribution across the entire development. By the time Walter left, I had a much fuller picture of who my grandfather had been. Not just the quiet man who'd taken me fishing and taught me to change a car's oil, but a visionary who'd built something meant to last generations. That evening, I drove out to the tower alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I climbed the ladder to the maintenance platform and sat with my back against the tank, looking out over the community as lights began to flicker on in windows across the development. My phone buzzed. Deanna had sent a photo of the new plaque with the caption, "Your grandfather would be proud." I typed back, "I hope so." Sitting there as darkness fell and the stars began to appear, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. I'd inherited something I didn't know existed, been thrust into a conflict I didn't want, and discovered a passion I didn't know I had. The water tower that had seemed like a bizarre surprise had become the center of my professional life and a connection to my grandfather's legacy. The quarterly payment had come in right on schedule the previous week. $47,000, paid without complaint or controversy. The money was useful, certainly, but it wasn't really why I maintained the tower. I did it because my grandfather had trusted me with something important. He'd built infrastructure that served hundreds of families, and now that responsibility was mine. I thought about Deborah Wallace and her scheme to push me out so her brother-in-law could profit. It seemed almost quaint now, though at the time it had been genuinely frightening. The lawsuit could have bankrupted me if I hadn't had the documentation to back up my position. The conflict could have dragged on for years. Instead, it had resolved relatively quickly, and I'd come out of it with not just the tower, but relationships, purpose, and a career I actually enjoyed. Sometimes I wondered who'd sent that anonymous email with the meeting minutes. I'd never found out, and nobody had ever come forward to claim credit. Whoever it was had done me a tremendous favor. My consulting business was growing steadily. I'd taken on 3 new projects in the past month alone. A small town in New Mexico that needed to upgrade its aging water system, a private ranch in northern Arizona that wanted to drill new wells, and a solar-powered pumping station for an off-grid community in Nevada. Each project was interesting and challenging in its own way. Diana had proven to be an excellent hire. She had a talent for explaining complex technical information in ways that regular people could understand, which was invaluable when dealing with city councils and homeowners associations. She'd also caught several potential issues with the Meadowbrook Springs system before they became actual problems, earning her keep several times over. I climbed down from the tower as full darkness settled over the desert. My truck was the only vehicle in the small parking area next to the fence that surrounded the tower complex. I locked the gate and drove home, already thinking about the next day's work. Life had settled into a rhythm. I spent my mornings working on consulting projects, my afternoons on tower-related business, and my evenings however I wanted. I'd moved out of my cramped Phoenix apartment into a house in Tempe, not far from where my grandfather had lived. It was nothing fancy, but it had a workshop where I could tinker with designs and prototypes, and a back patio where I could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. The holidays that year were different than they'd been in the past. I'd always spent them alone or with friends, my grandfather having passed away the previous year. But this year, Diana invited me to her family's Thanksgiving dinner, and Frank Martinez insisted I come to the HOA's Christmas party. I was becoming part of a community in a way I'd never experienced before. In January, almost 15 months after I'd first learned about the tower, I received an inquiry from a journalist writing a story about private infrastructure in America. She'd somehow heard about the Meadowbrook Springs water tower and wanted to interview me for her article. Her name was Jennifer Ross, and she worked for a magazine called Infrastructure Today. We met at the coffee shop where I'd first negotiated peace with the HOA board. "So you really own the only water source for an entire neighborhood?" Jennifer asked, her recorder sitting on the table between us. "I own the tower and the equipment. The water itself comes from the municipal supply. The tower is essentially a large-scale pressurization and distribution system. But without your tower, those 847 homes would have no water. They'd have to connect to the city system directly, which would require significant infrastructure investment. Tearing up streets to lay new mains, installing meters at each house, that sort of thing. It would be expensive and disruptive." Jennifer scribbled notes even though she was recording. "And you charge them about $18 per household per month." "Roughly, yes. It varies slightly based on the quarterly fee divided by the number of homes, but that's the average." "That seems incredibly reasonable. Municipal water in Scottsdale averages about $50 a month for a typical household." My grandfather wasn't trying to maximize profit. He wanted to provide good service at a fair price and maintain the system properly. "Tell me about the lawsuit." I gave her the broad strokes, leaving out some of the more personal details about Deborah Wallace's conflict of interest. Jennifer was a good interviewer, asking probing questions but not pushing when I indicated something was off the record. "What would you say to other people who find themselves in unusual property situations like yours?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "Know what you have. Document everything. And don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, but also be willing to find reasonable compromises." The HOA and I could have fought in court for years, but instead we found a way to work together that serves everyone's interests. The article came out in March, and to my surprise, it got picked up by several larger publications. I did a few radio interviews and even a short segment on a local TV news show. The attention brought in more consulting work, to the point where I had to turn down projects because I didn't have the capacity. I hired 2 more engineers and rented office space in Scottsdale. What had started as a one-man operation was becoming an actual company. Diana became my operations manager, overseeing the day-to-day work while I focused on business development and the more complex technical challenges. The Meadowbrook Springs Tower remained the cornerstone of it all. It was the proof of concept, the demonstration that private infrastructure could work when managed responsibly. When pitching new clients, I could point to 40 years of reliable service, 0 major failures, and satisfied customers. In April, I got a call from an attorney in Texas. A similar situation had developed in a suburb of Houston, where a private well system served a small community, and the HOA was trying to force the owner to sell. The owner had read the article about me and wanted to know if I'd be willing to consult on his case. I spent a week in Houston, reviewing contracts and inspecting the well system. The situation was different in the details but similar in principle. The owner, a man named Robert Chen, had maintained the wells impeccably, but a new HOA board wanted to bring everything under their direct control. "They keep saying it's about accountability," Robert told me as we stood next to one of the well houses. "But I think it's really about control. They don't like that there's something in this community they don't manage." "That was part of it in my case too," I said. Some HOA boards can't handle the idea that they don't control everything within their boundaries. I helped Robert organize his documentation and connected him with Gerald Hampton, who was willing to consult on the Texas case, even though he wasn't licensed to practice there. The last I heard, Robert had successfully defended his ownership and the HOA had backed down. Back in Arizona, life continued. The tower required constant but manageable attention. A pump needed replacement in June. The exterior coating had to be touched up in August. The filtration system got a major upgrade in October. Each expense was documented, each invoice sent to the HOA and paid without drama. I started dating someone I met at a professional conference, an environmental engineer named Sarah who worked for the state. We bonded over shared frustrations with bureaucracy and a mutual love of hiking. She thought the water tower story was hilarious and insisted on climbing up to the maintenance platform on our third date. "Your grandfather was either brilliant or crazy," she said, looking out over the development. "Both, probably. Well, it worked out for you, eventually. There were some rough months there." She turned to face me, her back against the railing. "But you fought for it. That says something." "I didn't really have a choice. It was my inheritance." "You always have a choice. You could have sold out to the HOA, taken whatever they offered and walked away. Instead, you stood your ground and turned it into something more." I'd never thought about it quite that way, but she was right. I'd made a choice, maybe not consciously at first, but definitely as things progressed. I'd chosen to honor my grandfather's work, to maintain his standards, to see the conflict through rather than taking the easy way out. As the second anniversary of my grandfather's death approached, I organized a small memorial gathering. Deanna helped me put together a photo display showing the tower's construction and evolution over the decades. Frank Martinez arranged for the community center to host it. Walter Hodges came and brought several other people who'd worked on the original development. We shared stories, looked at old photographs, and raised glasses to Thomas Nichols, the stubborn engineer who'd built something that lasted. My grandfather had been a private man, not one for public recognition, but I thought he'd appreciate being remembered this way, not with grand speeches or elaborate ceremonies, but with the simple acknowledgement that his work mattered and continued to serve. That evening, after everyone had left, I drove out to the tower one more time. It was becoming a ritual, these solitary visits when I needed to think or just wanted to feel connected to something larger than myself. I climbed to the top and sat on the platform, watching the lights of Meadowbrook Springs flicker in the darkness. My phone had a dozen messages from the day's gathering. Photos, thank yous, stories people had forgotten to share earlier. I scrolled through them, smiling at the memories being preserved and passed on. One message stood out. It was from an email address I didn't recognize, sent just an hour earlier. The subject line read, "From the friend who sent the meeting minutes." My heart rate picked up as I opened it. "Aaron, I hope you don't mind me reaching out after all this time. I'm Stephen Chen. I was the HOA secretary during the conflict with Deborah Wallace. I sent you those meeting minutes because what she was doing was wrong and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. I resigned from the board shortly after she stepped down because I'd lost faith in the process. But I wanted you to know that watching you fight for what was right and seeing how things worked out restored some of that faith. Your grandfather built something good. You're honoring that. Thank you. Stephen." I sat there for a long time, reading and rereading the message. I'd wondered for over a year who had sent those minutes, who had taken the risk of exposing Deborah's scheme. Knowing it was Stephen, the quiet secretary who'd looked uncomfortable at that first meeting, made perfect sense. He'd been in a position to see everything but hadn't had the power to stop it directly. So he'd done what he could, I wrote back. "Stephen, thank you for reaching out and thank you for what you did. It took courage. I hope you're doing well. If you're ever interested in getting involved with the HOA again, I think the current board could use people with your integrity. Aaron." As I climbed down from the tower and locked up for the night, I felt a sense of completion. The conflict was truly over, not just legally but emotionally. The tower was secure, the community was served, and my grandfather's legacy was intact. Driving home through the quiet streets of Scottsdale, I thought about everything that had changed since that meeting in Gerald Hampton's office. I'd gained a career, a purpose, and a place in a community. I'd learned things about my grandfather and about myself. I'd fought a battle I didn't want and come out stronger for it. The water tower stood against the night sky behind me, its lights blinking in steady rhythm, pumping water to hundreds of homes where people were washing dishes, taking showers, filling coffee pots for the morning. None of them thinking about where that water came from or how it got there. That was exactly how it should be. Infrastructure, when done right, is invisible. It just works, day after day, year after year, asking nothing but proper maintenance and respect for the people who built it. My grandfather understood that. And now, finally, so did I. The invoices would keep coming, quarterly and precise, just as they had for nearly 40 years. The payments would arrive, the maintenance would continue, and the tower would keep serving the community it was built for. Not because I needed the money or the recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Because sometimes the most important work is the work nobody notices until it stops. And I was going to make damn sure it never stopped.